The Chalke History Festival special series on History with Jackson. So hello everyone, welcome back to History with Jackson. Today we welcome back author and historian Max Adams to discuss his fantastic new book, The Mercian Chronicles, King Offa and the Birth of the Anglo-Saxon State. How you doing, Max?
I'm very well, thank you.
I'm really glad to have you back and to be talking about this brand new book. But, first question I want to ask you, bit of a cliche one, but what inspired you to write this book?
Well, as you know, I'd written about 7th century Northumbria, the sort of cradle of northern Christianity. I'd written about Alfred and the Vikings and tried to turn that into a book really about the British Isles rather than just Wessex against the foreigners. And I'd written about that really dark, obscure period that people often know as the Age of Arthur. And, this is clearly the gap in the middle, and it's the elephant in the room of Norman conquest history. What about Mercia? And the reason nobody's really taken this on in this, of course, there are lots of Mercian historians, but nobody's tried to sort of pull it all together as a narrative because we simply don't have a narrative. We don't have Bede. We don't really have the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. If there was a Mercian narrative historian in this period, their work doesn't survive. We don't know who they might be. And it's a complete mystery. And so cobbling together an idea of a sort of continuous historical narrative is really a bit like going into an old-fashioned film cutting room and just finding millions of fragments of celluloid on the floor and just trying to take them together in some sort of combination that you think makes some kind of sense. And in the end, I knew I was going to have to tackle this sort of historical mountain, really, and just take it on and see what emerged. And as always, or so often with these things, what emerges is something you didn't quite anticipate at the beginning.
It's certainly, a fascinating period. And the fact that you're able to piece together all the fragments that we have to create a picture of what's happening at that time is really interesting. But there might be quite a few listeners listening now thinking, well, what is Mercia? Where was it? What was it kind of made up of? Because it's before this Norman conquest era Britain that we know in the Roman period.
Well, I wish I could give you a nice, clear answer there. People ask me all the time, where were the boundaries of Mercia? I can't really tell you, but what I can give you a geographical sense of what we mean. So if we think of Mercia really as a confederation of a group of Midlands peoples, some of whom are historically very well attested, like the Huicher, who inhabited the Severn Valley and its hinterland. We have the Middle Anglians, who are a sort of conglomerate of their own sort of groups of people in the East Midlands. We have the sort of Mercians proper, who seem to have emerged either side of the upper River Trent. Mercia, of course, the name itself means the boundary people. It's the same word that comes into the medieval period as the marches, the Anglo-Welsh marches. And it's traditionally thought that Mercia relates to Wales, but that has never entirely satisfied me. And I can't really give you a good answer except the fact that we have a good idea that the core lands of Mercia, the original core lands, are around the upper Trent in the sort of region of Lichfield, Tamworth, Repton, that sort of northwest corner of the Midlands. And I wonder if it's the border in question is actually to do with where four medieval counties actually meet. And it may be something as simple as that. But perhaps the best idea to give viewers an understanding of how Mercia pulls together as really almost the first English nation state is if you draw a theoretical line between Chester and London, Chester in the northwest, London on the Thames in the southeast, Lincoln in the northeast, and shall we say Gloucester, Exeter in the southwest, you get an X. And that's a pretty good way of showing the extent of Mercian power and also the secret to Mercian success, because that X, which is comprised of the Fossway, which is a Roman road that goes all the way from Lincoln to the southwest, and Watling Street, which famously, of course, goes from Chester to London. And those roads don't just provide you with a sort of Midland square. They also do what the Romans understood very well, which is they connected the important navigable riverheads on the key rivers that the Romans needed to control and gave them access via side roads to all sorts of places into which shipping could come. So it's a network of control that the Romans constructed and understood. And at some point, the Mercian kings begin to understand their own history and see what opportunities this connected highway of water and fast military roads can do for them.
It's really interesting seeing that linkage between rivers and the Roman Empire, what they left behind. But then, you say that within the book, you've mentioned quite a few rivers. You mentioned the Trent, the Severn Valley, the Nen or the Nene, as we were discussing before this call. How were they able to use those riverways to build themselves up? Because there are several other kingdoms in England at this point.
There are. Well, I suppose going back to the beginning, that Mercia rises as a power, or rather Mercian warlords arise as powerful kings in the second quarter of the 7th century. So contemporary with King Oswald of Northumbria, who I've written about before, is a great pagan Mercian warlord known as Penda, who seems to come from somewhere in the southwest. He probably belongs in the lands of the Huichie, either side of the Severn Valley. He may well come from British background, ethnically speaking, if we care about ethnic identity in this period. And he defeats a series of Northumbrian warlords, and it gives him bragging rights. And from that point, his dynasty is on the throne of Mercia for 150 years. His sons are kings after him, and his grandsons are kings after him. Crucially, in this dynasty, in the 8th century, two kings of Mercia, King Athelbald and King Offa, between them reign for 80 years. King Athelbald, who's the much less well-known king than Offa, is the longest reigning English king before Edward III, 41 years. And if you think of that in an era where we are supposed to believe that people die young, these kings are on the throne for 41 years, and then Offa 39 years. That sort of dynastic stability gives you the opportunity to invest in ideas beyond mere winning battles. It allows you to invest in an idea of something that might survive the death of a king, something that is robust enough to continue into the future as a legacy. And to all intents and purposes, that means you create a state, the first really early medieval state in England. The Northumbrians haven't done that. The kings of Wessex, when they do it, are copying the Mercian kings. So your question was, how do Mercian kings understand this relationship between the roads and the rivers, and how you extract political and economic power from them? I suppose the answer is I'm not sure it's the Mercian kings who do it. And in fact, I couldn't say who does figure it out. It's some people who may be Frisian traders. They may be the abbots and abbesses of a series of royal monasteries founded along all these rivers. It may be bishops, and it may be a new sort of aristocracy that's slightly more interested in living till old age than they are in dying in battle alongside the king. So they seem to swap the idea of live fast, die young, die gloriously, but for an idea of there's something that we might consider as a legacy that our children and our descendants might benefit from. But somebody starts to invest very heavily in the landscape, and I think that the obvious finger to point to is the monasteries. They're given land permanently, forever, unlike warriors who hold land for a life interest. And so these monasteries begin to invest in their land. They very often site themselves on navigable rivers. Now, whether that's with trade aforethought or whether that's just an ideal place for a monastery is difficult to tell. By the middle of the 8th century, these monasteries are not just subsisting, they are profitably trading along this network of roads and rivers. And picking up on the niceties of that is really tricky, but there's enough evidence now to show that is what's happening. Under the king's patronage, whether at their behest or whether for their profit is another matter.
It's certainly an interesting mix of what's going on in the picture. And there's so many things I wanna pull on there and discuss a bit further. But I think central to that really is the role of religion. And I know there's someone that you find incredibly interesting within this book. But the rise of Christianity within Mercia, how is it, as you said, it's helping economically, but how is it also interacting with the monarchy? Because I think there's a very interesting dynamic here.
Yeah, there is. The institution of the church is originally based around two possible ideas. One that comes from Ireland and the North, which is based on the idea of holy men and women starting up communities of like-minded people in the service of God. And been given land out of the king's own property portfolio on which to found monastery. Now, a monastery is not just a church, a monastic community is not just a church and a few dwellings, it's an estate sufficient to support that monastery in the way that a great warrior lord would be supported by estates. So you're given the right to extract from an area of land, a known area of land, all the renders of food, which is, things like cattle and sheep, it's honey, it's bread, it's ale, it's services, all of which are brought together in one place and consumed on the spot. Things aren't being traded. It's a consumptionist centripetal model. Everything comes into the center. That model works for the church and it works for secular lords, the warrior lords. The church, of course, keeps its land in perpetuity. At the same time, the church has a duty of pastoral care to all the people in its lands, and the monasteries, the early churches, which are nearly all monasteries, owe some sort of obedience to their bishops, and the bishops arise where old tribal centres of power were. So Chalke, this ancient early medieval tribe, has a bishop of its own. The Middle Anglians have a bishop of their own. The peoples of the original Mercia have a bishop in Lichfield, and so on. And eventually, Mercian kings are able to extend their reach such that the Bishop of London, very, very powerful, wealthy bishop, is part of the Mercian setup as well. So these bishops and these abbots and abbesses, they don't come from nowhere. Essentially, they are collateral members of the royal family. Okay? So although you're giving this land away to God and the monastery, you're actually keeping it in the family. And that's a really useful way. And by the way, I'm not trying to be cynical about this. I have no doubt that the abbesses and abbots and all their flock and the bishops are devout Christians. There's no reason to think they weren't at all. But they're also pragmatists, and they understand about the relationship between land and power and the kings. So if you like, bishops and abbots and abbesses are also lords over land. They are territorial lords. Their relationship to the peasants on their land is very similar to the relationship between a warrior lord and his or her peasants. It's the permanence of those religious institutions and the permanence of those places of institutional worship that allows them to invest in things like water mills, which are a huge material investment with a slow but steady payback, literally a slow but steady payback, to invest in breeding new types of cattle or new strains of crop. So that they're not just eating what they produce and producing what they eat. They have a transferable surplus that changes everything. And on the back of that tradable surplus, Mercian kings, whether knowingly or just by taking advantage of it expediently, create an apparatus of state at the top of which they sit. But that state has a sort of religious civil service. It has a productive landscape. It has a trading surplus. And that surplus nets the kings sufficient income that it becomes less and less interesting to go and fight other kings with the possibility you might get killed. And of course, they do get killed here and there. Mercian kings are really quite successful at not getting killed. 41 years is a pretty long time to not get whacked over the head. Even Athelbald does eventually get whacked over the head, but not by another king. So we can't impute motive to these kings because we just don't know enough about them individually. We don't have a bead to tell them what they were like. We have the odd narrative source that tells us what people are like, but really we don't know what Offa was like or Athelbald was like, but they are really good at what they're doing somehow.
Yeah, they seem like really, really capable administrators and actually really popular administrators as well.
Well, there's something to be said for peace. There are enough notices of natural disasters. The terrible winter of 764, for example, the dreadful plague of 664, which seems to be the Black Death, which recurs. And I think there may be a massive depopulation of the English countryside in the late 7th century, which may be partly underpinning the lack of warfare. There may not be enough people to do the fighting, but people survive. Terrible winters are followed by droughts and cattle pestilence and so on. Life is hard, but communities are resilient. And the monasteries and the church institutions are really resilient. I mean, if you think of the disruption caused by the Viking Wars, the Norman conquest, all sorts of other things going on throughout medieval history, and yet there was a Bishop of Worcester in the 680s, and there is still a Bishop of Worcester. There's a Bishop of London, and there was in, six whenever. There are bishops at Peterborough, which was then called Medeshamstede, with a little bit of discontinuity, but they're the same places. London is still the most important place. And the great county towns of the Midlands, that industrial heartland of the Midlands that runs from, Stafford, Lichfield, Derby, Nottingham, Stamford, Lincoln, Leicester, Northampton, Bedford, all those are towns created under the peace and prosperity of the Mercian kings of the 8th and 9th centuries. The great prosperity of England, its source of medieval power, what makes it so attractive to invade, is this enormous amount of wealth that comes out of the Midlands in the 8th and 9th centuries. And we could, perhaps talk about what that tradable surplus is made of, because it's quite interesting stuff, really. But I know there are many other things to probe. So ask away.
That was going to be my next question, actually. That trade, what is it, and where is it going? Because there's such an area of Europe to pry into.
Yeah, well, we know little bits about trade, and we suspect a great deal more. We know, for example, that the area around Droitwich, which is just northeast of Worcester on the River Salwarp, was a centre of the salt production business during the Iron Age and then the Roman period. There are natural salt springs that come to the surface at Droitwich, a town which I think may be the oldest industrially productive continuing town in Britain. Those salt springs produce salt at a brine concentration 10 times that of seawater. It's much, much easier and cheaper to make solid salt from Droitwich salt springs than it is to make salt out of the sea. You have to make a lead pan. As it happens, there is lead in Mercia, in the Derbyshire peaks. You need vast quantities of firewood or charcoal to heat the pans to boil the salt off. You need a trading network to get that salt to where people will buy it. And of course, salt's an incredibly valuable commodity. It's used to preserve and flavour food. It's used in chemical processes. And we know, because the historical research has been done, that there are these saltways that radiate south and southeast from Droitwich, many of them ending up on the Thames. And we have a pretty shrewd idea that the Bishop of Worcester, who happens to have a profitable trading hall on the banks of the Thames at London, is doing a very sharp deal in both producing salt and trading it and taxing it. Okay, the Bishop of Worcester is a very, very canny. Successive bishops of Worcester, very, very canny individuals. So that's the salt trade is big. We know from when European silver coinage comes into England and is occasionally accidentally lost. We have a few thousand Mercian coins now, and from those few thousand, numismatists can predict many, many millions of coins being produced. Silver is definitely coming into Mercia, and what's going out in return is, salt, wool, finished textiles. There's a thing called opus Anglicanum, very, very fine textiles and embroidery and tapestry being produced in English monasteries, which is it's ending up on the continent. Whether we call it trade or whether we call it gift exchange, which is probably what they would have called it, perhaps doesn't matter. In fact, if I may indulge you,
of course,
I've got a quote, or rather, if you would indulge me, I should say, I've got a quote that sort of highlights how this works. Okay, it's a wonderful letter from an English king, not a Mercian king, but a contemporary of theirs, to an Englishman who has become the Archbishop of Mainz. England is exporting religion, along with other things, and religion, of course, is not tradable, but it is a commodity in some respects. Here's this fragment of this great letter. This is a Kentish king writing to Bishop Boniface. I'm sending your grace a few gifts: a silver drinking cup lined with gold, weighing 3.5 pounds, and 2 woolen cloaks, not in the hope of receiving any earthly gift, but for your prayers. There is one other favour I have to ask, namely, to send me a pair of falcons, quick and spirited enough to attack crows without hesitation and bring them back to earth after catching them. There are few hawks of this kind in Kent. Well, one gift is reciprocated by another, but its trade by any other name. And we've got tons of examples of these reciprocal gifts going on, just giving us little clues. And of course, occasionally archaeology turns up the material evidence. We know that lava quernstones are being imported from Germany, highly valued commodity. We know that lead is moving around. We know that iron is moving around. We know that books are being produced in the monasteries, in their scriptoria, and being sent to the continent in high demand. Just for example, copies of the works of Bede are always in demand on the continent. So, book production is a big thing. A lot of the coins that we find lost in the 8th century are being lost in the Cotswolds. The Thames, of course, is navigable from Lechlade all the way down. And the place names along the Thames tell us that there are wharfs and windlasses and all the sort of paraphernalia you need to lift boats out of the river and so on. And in particular, in recent years, Reading University have been excavating at a monastery called Cookham, well known on the Thames as a setting for the Wind in the Willows, a beautiful part of the world. Cookham was a monastery, a royal monastery. Its abbesses were royal women, but we now know from excavations there that it was a highly profitable trading estate. There's metalworking going on. There's all sorts of industrial processes. And if you think about monasteries on rivers, raw material can come downriver to them. They process it and they send it on down the river. And people like bishops of London and Worcester can take a tax. And the king, of course, is taking taxes and tolls on these things. It's a tariff business. I mean, tariffs are in the news all the time now. And frequently, the cannier abbesses, abbots and bishops are asking for remissions on tolls. That is, they're asking for a free trade passage of their goods to the continent. They don't want to pay tax. Nobody wants to pay tax. And in return for the king granting them these special favourable trading rights, of course, they pray for the king's soul, which is very decent and generous of them. And the king is very glad for their prayers. So, everybody's doing really well out of this.
It's a really nice way of, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. Maybe Trump is trying to be a Mercian king as opposed to a president on that front.
The reason this works is because of a very successful patronage system. And in the patronage system, it is as important for those lower down to know who their lord is so they can benefit from their protection. Free trade is also about protection. Now, we know about protection rackets from mobsters and mafiosi who protect shopkeepers and traders from other mobs in return for a cut of the profits. Well, protectionism and trade wars are pretty much the same thing. And in fact, the first historically attested trade war in British history happens because the Emperor Charlemagne of France falls out with King Offa over a marriage proposal between their sons and daughters. And Charlemagne throws a hissy fit and tries to ban all trade across the Channel. Well, of course, it didn't work then, and it don't work now. Try stopping boats crossing the Channel. Yeah, good luck with that one.
But I think
it's diplomacy, it's European diplomacy is happening, and it's Mercian kings are doing it.
I think that's a really nice point. I think it shows Mercia kind of becoming this continental player.
Oh,
why
for
is
sure.
Why is it so important for Offa to do that?
He is part of the club of European Christian kings. Sometimes he gets to say who the Archbishop of Canterbury is going to be, when one dies. He corresponds with the Pope. He's a player, and he wants to be an equal player. He's an equal player with Charlemagne, but not as equal as he would like to be. So that when Charlemagne says, yes, I'll have one of your daughters to marry my son, and Offa says, that's a jolly good idea. One of your daughters can marry my son. And Charlemagne goes, no, sorry, mate, that's not the way it works. We hold, dare I say it, the trump cards, and you don't. And Charlemagne is so offended by Offa trying to act as an equal that he cuts him off. They make up in the end, just before King Offa dies. But it's a salutary lesson in how the Mercian kings have built themselves up to a point where Charlemagne has to send spies over to England. These are, of course, religious men interested in speaking to their Christian brethren in England, but they're intelligence gathering at the same time. You can be sure of that. One of them, of course, is a Northumbrian, Alcuin, the greatest scholar of his age, who teaches at the Imperial School in Aachen in Francia and is corresponding on a very interesting level with all sorts of people in England from whom he gathers intelligence. It's a really connected world. But I suppose that the thing that you could say that all that's inevitable. Once productive monasteries are controlling trade surpluses. What is different about what happens with Mercia is that somehow, somewhere along the line, royal administrators, whether it's kings, whether it's their whether it's their bishops who are very well read, very well connected with, and literate, of course. Kings don't write and they don't read. They rely on churchmen to do their reading for them, particularly bishops. We get this sense that at some point, probably in the reign of King Athelbald, Mercian kings realise, and I suspect it's because their territories are now so complex, they have to spend so much time on the road, travelling between royal estates, between the major monasteries, living off the fat of other people's land, as it were, that at some point they realise that they need to administer this complex network of centres of power, centres of wealth, centres of influence, because if they lose control of it, then Mercia collapses into its constituent parts very, very quickly. And we're back into tribal warfare, which is what's happening in Northumbria in this period, and it's happening in Wessex in this period. And the Mercian kings, during the period when King Offa and King Athelbald reign in Mercia, there are 11 kings in Northumbria, okay? And Mercia doesn't need that business. So at some point, the Mercian kings realise that they've got to confront a basic challenge. They've given a lot of land away to the church. That land would once have supported warriors to keep the Mercian army functioning. The number of warriors in the Mercian army are fewer, and quite a lot of the lords in different parts of Mercia beginning to wonder why, if the churches have land in perpetuity and are doing very well, thank you, from it, why shouldn't the secular lords, the loyal warriors, the people who do the king's business, why shouldn't they get a cut of that pie? Why shouldn't they have their land in perpetuity so they can pass it to their son, they can invest, they can trade, they can do all the things that the church does? Well, that starts to happen, and we know that starts to happen because the principal source of Mercian history in this period are charters. Charters generally written on behalf of the king, granting such and such a right or such and such a piece of land to a bishop, an abbot, a secular lord, whoever, in return for trading rights, salt rights, money, cash, whatever. But the problem is that as King Alfred famously later said, a king needs fighting men, paying men, and farming men. Well, there are beginning to be somewhat too many praying men and farming men and not enough fighting men. What the Mercian kings or their administrators do is conceive of a network of places from which they can exercise regional control. The term they use is burh, B-U-R-H. It's the origin of the English boroughs. King Alfred famously constructs a series of these fortified burhs or boroughs to defend against the Vikings. And it was always thought that the Alfredan system had invented it, but in fact we now know that it was Mercian kings who invented this system. And so along this crisscross network of roads and at the heads of rivers in these very strategic places, they begin to found these burhs, they have earthworks around them. Are they defended? Well, they're defensible. Probably the principal thing about them is the prestige. They're places where trade can start to go on under the king's eye and under the king's tax collectors. They're places where regional power can be administered, judicial, legislative. They're places where charters might get written. And we now can start picking these places out in the Mercian landscape through place names, through archaeology, through coins turning up. Places like Salmonsbury near Bourne-on-the-Water, on the Fosse Way. Leicester seems to be a burh. There are places along pretty nearly all those navigable rivers. Sometimes a burh looks a bit like a monastery. Sometimes a monastery looks a bit like a burh. The problem that King Athelbald has is he wants to build infrastructure. He wants to build bridges that can cross the River Trent. Imagine, the River Trent is a huge, powerful river. But at some point in King Athelbald's reign, they build a bridge across it. Who builds the bridge? Somebody's got to owe Athelbald the labour and the engineering skills and the materials to build a bridge at a village called Cromwell. The archaeological remains of it were discovered in the 19th century. There must have been lots of other bridges, probably lots of water mills, lots of other things being built. Roads got to be mended. River wharfs have got to be maintained. Who's doing this stuff? And of course, the king needs an army. And at some point, Athelbald goes, hang on a second. All my warrior lords are claiming remission from all these services that I used to expect from them. But if he imposes those services, building fortifications, repairing bridges, repairing roads, serving in the king's army from his secular lords, they're going to say, well, hang on a second, what about the churches? So he comes to the decision that he will extract those same services, the common burdens, as he calls them, from the churches. Well, there's all hell to pay because the churches kick back like mad. The church is now really powerful. The bishops are really powerful. The abbots are powerful. So they have this series of synods, one of which we know happened at a place called Gumley, where there's sort of natural amphitheatre and a big mound in the middle where the king must have promulgated to his assemblies these great rulings about how he wants everyone to pay the same services. And one or two of these meetings happen at a place, incredibly, we don't know. It's called the famous place that is known as Clavicho. Famous to everybody, but we don't know where it was. I think somewhere like Hertford. Anyway, in a series of reforms, this sort of battle that keeps being paid off through history, right up until the time of the Henry VIII and the Reformation and thereafter, between the church trying to restrict the king's rights against what it sees as its privileges, and secular lords wondering why the church isn't paying its dues. And this battle goes on, but in the midst of all that, one of the solutions to this problem is to create effectively a state administration. And it may happen by chance, it may happen through very, very careful. There may be one brilliant person who figures it all out. I mean, it's a great intellectual achievement, as well as it's almost the equivalent of achievement of the way in which Britain responded to war and the approach of war in the 1930s, the sort of national effort. By the end of Offa's reign, the Mercian state, which is really the English state, is immensely powerful, well organised, resilient, except for one thing. But we won't talk about that.
When you create a state like that, how does it? Because there are still other kingdoms within England. How does it respond to these other kingdoms, and how do these other kingdoms respond to it? Because essentially it is just a super state in the middle of England.
You buy them off the same way the UK has been buying Scotland off and Wales off for the last few hundred years. Sorry, I mean, let's tell it like it is.
Yeah.
You buy them off, and you buy them by giving their kings your prettiest daughter. You buy them off by giving them privileges. You buy them off by giving them privileged, honourable places at your table. I mean, there were independent kings of Fuicha in the late 7th century, and then suddenly they're the eldermen of the Mercian kings signing his charters, getting all sorts of privileges in their lands, but they're not kings anymore. He tries to do the same with Kent. King Offa tries to do the same with Kent and annexes it, but it never really ends well. They try to do the same with Wessex, and it sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. They have a sort of unhappy agreement with Northumbria. The Humber is pretty much it, okay? Humber's a difficult river to cross. Mercia keeps Lincolnshire. Northumbria is allowed to trade across that border, and, it's a marriage of convenience. Wales is a whole other matter, and we might have to talk about Wales because there's this big thing that somebody built along the Welsh border.
You were talking about those defensive burghs earlier.
Yeah.
Being defensible, trying to defend some of these major trade towns. What else does the Mercian state or kingdom do to protect itself, build to protect itself?
Well, assassination often helps. A few kings of East Anglia are assassinated here and there. It's mafia tactics. It's bullying, it's protectionism, it's an offer you can't refuse. The Welsh are never susceptible to these offers, as it were. By the way, I should admit that I nearly persuaded my publisher to call the book On Offa, but...
That would have been brilliant.
Well, it would have been fun, wouldn't it? Yeah, we need to talk about Offa's Dyke, don't we? The extraordinary thing, one of the many extraordinary things about Offa's Dyke is that we don't really know who built it, and we don't know when it was built. Bishop Asa, who was a member of King Alfred's court, and possibly one of the people behind the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he said that there was in former times a great and powerful King Offa who fought off all the nations around him and built a famous dyke. So there's no real reason to think it wasn't King Offa. It would in a way be more convenient if it was King Athelbald for various reasons. But anyway, King Offa it is. But many, many archaeologists have dug holes in Offa's dyke. We've never yet got a date out of it. Never yet. At some point we will, because we now have a technique for dating buried soil horizons called optically stimulated luminescence, OSL. Watts Dyke, which is a smaller sibling, if you like, some miles to the east and in the north end of Offa's Dyke, we do have a date off that. That's early 9th century, post-Offa. It would be handy in a way if Watts Dyke was the prototype for Offa's Dyke, but it's not that way. It's not that convenient. Offa's Dyke is constructed for several reasons. One is performative. The act of being able to force people to build it is a performance of power. Remember, again, we go back to contemporary politics. We're going to build a wall. Who's going to pay for it? Not us. They're going to pay for it. There's going to be a wall built to stop Mexicans coming out, and Mexico's going to pay for it. Well, it's possible that Offa's Dyke was built by prisoners of war or tributary labour. That in itself is an act of power in the landscape. And that boundary if it is a boundary, goes all the way from the mouth of the River Severn estuary, pretty nearly to Chester. It's a brilliant engineering masterpiece, and I've walked it. How the hell they surveyed it, I mean, I have some ideas, but it's an astounding achievement. It never seems to have been fortified in like Hadrian's Wall was, but we now know from various place names that there were probably people who had responsibility for controlling sections of it, what we would later call marcher lords. They had lookout places, and they had points where they could exercise more control than others. And certainly the little narrow valleys that cross from east to west across that frontier region are nearly all blocked by Offa's Dyke. If you want to come over here and nick our cattle, you're going to have to go the long way round. That's, I think, part of it. So it has multiple roles. It has performative roles. It's a zone of control. I don't think I would give it much more than that, but it's certainly a statement of immense power and capability. After all, there was nothing else bigger built for a very long time afterwards. It's a huge achievement, and that's the achievement of a state, not of a tribal kingdom.
I think it's, as you say, it is such a symbol of power. But then, when that head of power, Offa, when he dies, how does this kingdom respond, and what happens to it? Because when you've had, two kings back to back, 41 years and 39 years, that naturally would be assumed to be a point of instability.
It is. I mean, it'd be lovely if we had time to talk about King Offa's queen, but more importantly, in some respects, is the fact that he has a son, only one son, and that son succeeds him and dies after a year. That's a big problem, because the son doesn't have heirs of sufficient age to take over the kingdom. So you're right, instability, of the sort that Mercia has been trying to protect itself against, that's happening in the other kingdoms around it. As it happens, the next king after Offa's son, we're talking the year 796 onwards, 796, reigns for 20 years. So there isn't immediately stability. Offa is looked back on as a golden age, partly because of the Dyke, partly because of his relations with Charlemagne, which are written about by contemporaries. His two immediate successors after his son do pretty well, but unfortunately for Mercia, the breakup of this long-running dynasty coincides with the rise of a dynasty in Wessex that does very well, and the first really powerful king in this dynasty, Egbert, who's been in exile in France for many years, defeats Mercian armies 2 or 3 times, and he is the grandfather of King Alfred. Okay, so there's the rise of Wessex. But probably a bigger issue is the fact that we have predatory raiders beginning to come across the North Sea, who, starting with a raid on the south coast in 787, then with the very famous raid on Lindisfarne in 793, the sort of traditional heralding of the Viking Age, then increasingly they begin to pick off coastal monasteries. Remember, in Scandinavia, treasure is hoarded by fire-breathing dragons and can only be won by brave warriors with mighty swords. In England, treasure is guarded by prematurely balding men wielding staffs and prayers and crosses, and it's not much of a contest. And these monasteries are hugely wealthy. We know that their churches were festooned with bling, with gold, with plate, with tapestry. They're incredibly wealthy places, and they're really dead easy to pick off. And Mercia's great strength, which is understanding this network of routeways across the Midlands that connect the Irish Sea, the Severn Estuary, the North Sea, and the Channel, the Vikings know about the same routeways as well, because they've been trading across the North Sea for 100 years and more. They know that if you sail up the River Nen from the Wash as far as Northampton, if you can get to Northampton, but certainly to Peterborough and points higher than that, they also know at what point you can disembark from your boats, pick a bunch of horses, ride to the next head of a navigable river and do the same again and meet the fleet coming round. So once Viking armies find continental Europe too hot, which they do in the 860s, they invade England. They invade East Anglia first, then they invade Mercia. They depose Mercian kings, or at least they appear to depose Mercian kings, and Mercian kings are eventually left with a rump of Mercia between Lichfield and Worcester, really. By the time that Mercian kings can fight back successfully, Alfred is in control of the narrative. So that even though Alfred's greatest battle against the Vikings may well have been a joint effort with a Mercian king, and we suspect that because there was a joint issue of a coin called the Two Emperors coin, featuring both kings on it, both Alfred and Ceolwulf II of Mercia. But by that time, Alfred is in control of the narrative. And the narrative of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is to effectively remove Mercia from history. And that includes Alfred's own daughter, Athelflaed, who is, of course, known as the Lady of the Mercians, the wife of really the last active Mercian king. So it's an accident of history in lots of ways that happens. And who knows if a Mercian narrative history was written and was destroyed by the Vikings, or whether it was never written. We can't say.
Well, I think that's actually a really nice time to ask you a final fun question as well, Max. So you are a keen musician. And obviously writing history, writing books can be quite a stressful endeavour, quite a busy endeavour as well. So what instrument did you play to try and relax?
Well, I suppose the best way of relaxing with music is to play with other musicians, but I haven't had time to do that for quite a long time. I suppose there are two sorts of musical relaxation for me. One is I have a little Appalachian dulcimer made for me by a friend, which is a lovely instrument. I can just sort of pick it up. It's sort of next to me and I can pick it up and twiddle on it and write tunes. And it's nice and quiet, so I don't ruin anybody else's life. And that's very relaxing. But if I need to work out some serious historical problem, then it's downstairs to the drum kit. That's where we have to go. I won't say I'm working out my anger, because that's not how drumming works. You're actually something's a bit like walking, actually, in the sense that those sort of repeated syncopated rhythms are actually allowing you to sort of decompress, almost like defragmenting a hard drive. It's just it just kind of gets the brainwaves back into this mode of existing in the present, rather than overstressing about it's really the intensity of the work with writing books like this, trying to hold it all in your head at once, knowing that really you're doomed to fail. There's always this one fact you think, I've got to try and then where does that fit in, and then what date did this happen, and then trying to work, and all the names of the kings and all that stuff that blows your head. You literally fuses blowing in your head all the time. So music is one of those things, as you say, allows you to kind of decompress a bit. And just people often ask me, how do you maintain the self-discipline to research and write? Well, you'll probably have been asked the same question. For me, the self-discipline to get up and write and research, you're driven to do that because you're a writer and because you're interested in it. The real problem, the real self-discipline, is knowing when to walk away. Because if you never walk away, you go mad. So you do have to know that you have to go away and tinkle on a musical instrument, or go out to go walk or cook or whatever. Not remove yourself from the real world. Taking time off, that's the hard thing.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I totally agree. That is the hardest part. And I think that's really nice that you've got those two different styles of relaxing and getting yourself back on track. I think that's a lovely, lovely answer. Thank you very much for that, Max.
Well, you're very welcome.
Then obviously, we've touched on a tiny percentage of all of the history you've looked at in your book. So where can people grab a copy of the Mercian Chronicles?
Well, I think it's in all the bookshops at the moment and the usual outlets, but my website, which is www.theambulist, all one word, theambulist.co.uk, that features news on where I'm going to be talking next. So I've got a lot of speaking engagements. I'm doing the York Festival of Ideas. I'm in Gloucester at the end of April. I'm in Chalke Valley in August. Oh, there are lots of others. Anyway, if you look on the website, you'll find out where I'm going to be talking about the book, and you can get signed copies of the book on my website. Please don't all rush at once, because I don't need another job. But anyway, so you can find copies of my books on the website.
And I'll make sure they're both linked in the description below. And then if people want to keep up to date with you, where can they go?
Same again with the website. Whatever I'm doing, whatever projects I'm on, is usually somewhere on the website. And I'm always here and there talking at places, so people can catch up with me.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for coming on again, Max. I've really, really enjoyed this.
Well, and thank you. It's always a great pleasure.
The Chalke History Festival special series on history
with Jackson.